Emma, you're embarrassing yourself again. Some people just don't have what it takes for this level of sophistication. The words hit me harder than a slap across the face. Around our table at the Riverside Country Club, 5 women suddenly became very interested in their champagne glasses, their eyes avoiding mine like I'd just announced I had a contagious disease. I'm Emma, 34 years old, and I've been married to David for 5 years. His mother Patricia has been finding creative ways to remind me I don't belong in their world since day one. Today's charity luncheon was supposed to be different. Today I was going to prove I could handle sophisticated society. Sometimes the worst pain comes wrapped in perfect manners. It's not personal, dear, Patricia continued, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. But organizing charity auctions requires understanding luxury, dealing with collectors who write six-figure checks, managing relationships with people who actually matter in this community. The other committee members shifted uncomfortably. Margaret dabbed her lips with her napkin. Joyce suddenly found her phone fascinating. Linda studied the auction catalog like it contained state secrets. Nobody was going to defend me. Patricia gestured toward the planning materials spread across our table. Items worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for the annual charity auction I'd volunteered to help organize 6 months ago. Emma tries so hard with her little contributions, she said, pausing just long enough to let that word little settle like acid on an open wound. But this level of event planning requires connections, understanding how elite circles actually function. Being politely destroyed feels worse than honest cruelty. My hand stayed steady as I reached for my water glass, though inside I felt like I was drowning. How many times had Patricia found new ways to explain that my middle-class background made me fundamentally unsuitable for their family? That my father being a high school principal instead of a CEO was evidence of my limitations? Perhaps Emma could handle volunteer coordination, Joyce suggested, her diplomatic tone making it clear she wanted this uncomfortable conversation to end. Every event needs reliable people for setup. Perfect. Patricia's smile could have powered the entire country club. Emma has wonderful practical skills. She could manage the crew that arranges tables, coordinates with catering, handles all the behind-the-scenes work. Behind the scenes. Again. After 5 years of marriage, countless family dinners, and dozens of these events, I was still being pushed toward the kitchen instead of invited to the dining room. Actually, I said quietly, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded, I've been doing some charity work of my own lately. When you're tired of being invisible, speaking up feels like shouting. Patricia's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up with polite curiosity. Oh? The church? Bake sale? Elementary school fundraiser? Something more focused on financial accountability, I replied, reaching into my purse for the folder I'd brought specifically for this moment. Community oversight of charitable organizations. The words dropped into our conversation like a stone into still water. Margaret leaned forward with genuine interest. Joyce set down her champagne with a soft clink that seemed loud in the sudden quiet. Financial accountability? Patricia's laugh sounded forced now. Emma, darling, that sounds terribly complicated for someone without business experience. You'd be surprised what you learn when you start paying attention, I said, opening my folder with the careful movements of someone revealing important cards. Especially when you start connecting donations to business relationships. The most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes is harmless. Patricia's confidence flickered for just a moment before reassembling itself. I'm sure whatever community project you've discovered feels very important to you. It's important to several people, particularly donors who believe their money funds community programs instead of private business deals. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret's eyes sharpened with the look of someone who'd just heard something very interesting. Joyce exchanged a glance with Linda that spoke volumes about their own experiences with questionable charity accounting. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Patricia said carefully, her musical voice losing some of its practiced charm. "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied, closing the folder with a soft sound that felt final. "I'm just mentioning that my research has revealed fascinating connections between local charitable giving and business partnerships. Truth doesn't need fancy presentation. It speaks for itself." The afternoon light shifted through tall windows, casting new shadows across our table. Around us, the charity luncheon continued its elegant performance, but I could feel attention shifting toward our conversation like people sensing drama. Patricia was still talking, still explaining my inadequacies to women who'd worked with me for months, still treating my intelligence like a cute pet trick rather than actual capability. But I wasn't listening to her words anymore. I was thinking about the documentation in my folder, the patterns I'd spent months tracking, the phone calls I'd made to people who understood financial fraud better than anyone at this table. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people reveal exactly who they are. "Emma, dear, I think you're getting confused about some very complex relationships," Patricia was saying. I smiled for the first time since sitting down. "Actually, Patricia, I think my confusion is finally clearing up." So why did her sudden nervousness feel like the moment I finally understood the game we'd been playing? The estate sprawls across 43 acres of Connecticut countryside, far enough from Hartford that you forget the city exists, but close enough that David can still make his morning commute to the law firm. Most visitors see the impressive entrance, the circular driveway, the Georgian mansion that looks like it belongs in a magazine spread. What they don't see is the emptiness. Rooms so large that conversations echo. Family dinners where 3 people sit at a table built for 12. The way money creates distance instead of warmth. When you're used to feeling small, big spaces just make you feel smaller. I didn't chase this lifestyle. 5 years ago, I was finishing my master's degree in nonprofit administration when I met David at a coffee shop near campus. He was cramming for bar exams. I was writing my thesis on charitable accountability. He bought me coffee and listened to me complain about foundation corruption for 2 hours without looking bored. Back then, he thought my passion for financial transparency was cute. Admirable, even. When he mentioned his mother worked in charity fundraising, I imagined cozy conversations about nonprofit best practices. Hope makes us believe the best in people, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Patricia entered my life like winter fog, beautiful from a distance, suffocating up close. She had everything I'd imagined wanting in a mother-in-law: elegance, education, connections to cultural institutions across New England. She ran charity galas that raised millions for worthy causes. She also had opinions about everything: my clothes, my job, my family background, my apparent inability to understand how sophisticated people navigate social situations. "David deserves someone who enhances his professional reputation," she'd told him during our engagement, not knowing I could hear from the hallway. "Marriage isn't just romance, it's strategic partnership. Can Emma open the right doors?" Being discussed like a business decision cuts deeper than direct insults. The signs started early: questions about my little nonprofit job versus assumptions that I'd transition to meaningful charity work. Suggestions that I observe family business discussions rather than participate. Introductions to friends as David's wife instead of by my actual credentials. I watched David change from someone who'd fallen in love with my independence into someone scheduling family coordination meetings to discuss our social strategies. People don't naturally become calculating about love. They learn it from families who treat affection like currency. His calls grew shorter, more formal. Our conversations shifted from sharing daily experiences to him explaining proper protocols for family events. Last Christmas, he gave me a shopping consultation gift certificate with a card reading, "For developing your style." I missed the days when he'd given me books about social justice, pottery from local artists, weekend trips where we'd hike without checking phones every 5 minutes. The saddest part about losing yourself is watching someone you love forget who you used to be. Standing in that dining room today, watching Patricia orchestrate my humiliation with surgical precision, something crystallized. Not anger, though, that was definitely present. Not hurt, though that had been my constant companion for months. Clarity. Pure, bright understanding that this moment was teaching me something crucial about the difference between appearing sophisticated and being authentic. Sometimes getting dismissed is the permission you didn't know you needed to stop caring about approval. The charity committee position had been my idea 6 months ago. I'd suggested getting more involved with family philanthropic interests. Patricia graciously assigned me volunteer coordination duties, managing the practical details while she handled strategy and relationship management. What Patricia didn't realize was that my master's program included extensive coursework in charitable accounting, donor transparency, and ethical fundraising. More importantly, she didn't expect me to apply those skills to analyze her foundation's operations. The best camouflage is letting people assume you're exactly as capable as they want you to be. 6 months of committee meetings where I sat quietly taking notes. 6 months of organizing donor databases and reviewing financial reports. 6 months of Patricia treating my attention to detail as proof of my limitations. Someone focused on spreadsheets instead of strategy. She never considered that understanding spreadsheets might reveal where money goes when it disappears from charitable accounts. Real power isn't about impressing people. It's about knowing things they don't think you're smart enough to understand. The afternoon breeze carries the scent of approaching rain through expensive floral arrangements. Somewhere in this dining room, a pianist plays background music that sounds like a soundtrack for secrets being revealed. I'd spent 5 years learning Patricia's world, absorbing its rules and expectations like a student cramming for exams, learning which fork to use, which charities mattered, which families belonged in inner circles. Now it was time to demonstrate that I'd learned more than etiquette. The most sophisticated response to being underestimated is simply being more competent than anyone imagined possible. Patricia continues explaining my inadequacies to women who've worked with me for months, treating my intelligence like a minor inconvenience rather than actual capability. But I'm not listening anymore. I'm thinking about phone calls I've made to people who investigate financial fraud for a living, about documentation I've compiled over months of patient observation, about the moment when quiet competence becomes impossible to ignore. So why does being told I'm not good enough feel like finally getting permission to show exactly how good I actually am? Emma, sweetheart, maybe we should discuss this privately, Patricia suggests, but her voice carries that sharp edge she gets when conversations slip beyond her control. The charity luncheon keeps flowing around us, but I can feel attention shifting toward our table. Margaret has stopped pretending to study her auction catalog. Joyce is openly staring now. Linda looks like someone who just realized they're watching a train wreck in real time. Actually, I think this is exactly the right audience, I say, settling deeper into my chair. Everyone here serves on charity boards. I'm sure you'd all appreciate transparency in nonprofit operations. Sometimes the most devastating weapons are simply facts presented at the wrong time. Patricia's smile becomes brighter, more desperate. Emma, dear, I think you might be confused about how large-scale charitable operations actually function. My confusion has been clearing up beautifully, I reply, opening my folder and removing a single sheet of paper. Amazing what patterns you see when you start tracking donations alongside business contracts. I place the document where everyone can see it. Simple spreadsheet, elegant formatting, 2 clear columns, charitable donations to foundation, and business contracts awarded. The numbers tell their own story. Truth doesn't require dramatic presentation. It just requires good timing. This is very interesting data, Margaret says slowly, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who spent 30 years in corporate finance. The correlation between donations and contract awards is quite notable. Patricia laughs, but it sounds wrong now. Off-key. I'm sure there are perfectly reasonable explanations for any business relationships that might align with our donor base. Align, I repeat, letting the word hang there. Margaret, your husband's construction company donated $50,000 last spring, right? Margaret nods carefully. We've always supported community development. And 2 months later, his company got the contract for the new community center. $2.3 million project. The silence feels heavy now. Margaret's face goes very still, the expression of someone realizing they've been played by experts. When corruption hides behind charity, exposing it feels like sacrilege and justice simultaneously. Emma, Patricia's voice has lost all its music. You're making serious accusations based on coincidences and poor understanding of business relationships. You're right, they are serious. I agree. Joyce, didn't your art gallery donate $30,000 for cultural initiatives last fall? Joyce's nod is barely visible. And 3 weeks later, you received exclusive rights to provide artwork for all corporate offices. $400,000 in sales over 6 months. Mathematics doesn't lie, even when everyone involved wants it to. The afternoon light seems harsher now, cutting through the dining room's genteel atmosphere and exposing things that were supposed to stay hidden. Our elegant charity planning session has transformed into something that feels more like a deposition. Emma, have you calculated the total value? Margaret asks, her financial instincts overriding social politeness. Business contracts awarded to donors? I smile genuinely for the first time today. Approximately $12 million in contracts over 18 months, against charitable donations of roughly $400,000. Patricia stands abruptly, her chair making an ugly scraping sound. This is completely inappropriate. You're making accusations based on speculation. Actually, I'm making observations based on public records and foundation reports. Everything here was signed by you personally. The most dangerous oversight is keeping perfect records of illegal activity. Patricia, Margaret's voice could freeze champagne. I think we need to understand what Emma has discovered. What Emma has discovered, Patricia snaps, her composure finally cracking, is that she's completely out of her depth in sophisticated financial analysis. Then help me understand the sophistication, I say gently. Explain how construction companies donating to children's programs consistently receive construction contracts. Show me the sophisticated strategy behind art galleries funding literacy initiatives and then getting exclusive corporate deals. The challenge lands between us like a gauntlet. Patricia's face cycles through expressions: fury, calculation, something that might be fear. You're embarrassing yourself with amateur investigation, she says finally. Corporate relationships are complex. Charitable giving often reflects existing partnerships. I see. So charity follows business instead of business following charity? Exactly. Then you won't mind if I share this analysis with the State Attorney General's Charitable Oversight Division? I'm sure they'd appreciate such sophisticated nonprofit management. When someone claims expertise, offering expert review shouldn't be threatening. Patricia goes completely white. You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't dare what? Request transparency in charitable operations? Ask for accountability in nonprofit management? These are standard practices, Patricia. Unless your sophistication requires avoiding official oversight? The afternoon breeze carries jasmine scent through open windows. Somewhere across the dining room, someone is playing piano, classical pieces that sound like funeral music for carefully constructed lies. At our table, 4 women are processing the realization that their charitable contributions have been systematically converted into business opportunities for their families. Emma, Joyce says quietly, what exactly do you propose we do with this information? I look around the table at faces showing various stages of understanding. Margaret looks like someone calculating financial exposure. Joyce appears to be mentally reviewing every transaction her gallery made through foundation connections. Linda seems to be wondering whether her recent business success was earned or purchased. I propose we ensure donated money reaches its intended destinations instead of being redirected through elaborate relationship management. Sometimes justice is just insisting that organizations do what they claim to be doing. Patricia is still standing, gripping her chair like it's the only thing keeping her upright. Emma, you have no idea what you're interfering with. These are sophisticated business relationships between consenting adults. Are they consenting if they don't understand the real terms? Everyone involved benefits. Donors receive valuable business opportunities. The foundation receives necessary funding. And you receive? The question hangs there like smoke from an explosion. Patricia's mouth opens and closes without sound. So why does her panic feel like the moment I finally understood what power looks like when it stops hiding? What I propose, I say, closing my folder with soft finality, is making sure donated money actually reaches the causes people think they're supporting. The words settle over our table like morning fog, beautiful but revealing uncomfortable truths underneath. Patricia remains standing, white-knuckled grip on her chair, while the other women process what they've learned about their own charitable giving. Discovery works differently when you're not trying to prove anything, just following where facts lead. Emma, darling? Patricia's voice carries that desperate brightness of someone trying to restart a conversation that's already ended. I think you're misunderstanding complex financial relationships? Then educate me, I reply with genuine curiosity. Walk me through how Margaret's technology firm got the database management contract 2 weeks after her contribution. Margaret's face goes very still. I wasn't aware the timing was quite so precise. Or how Linda's architectural firm was selected for foundation headquarters design immediately after her family pledged to fund the building committee. Chronology doesn't lie, even when everyone wishes it would. Patricia sits back down slowly, movements careful like someone trying not to reveal how badly their hands are shaking. Emma, you're implying that foundation vendor selection is somehow inappropriate. I'm documenting patterns. For what purpose? The question hangs in air thick with expensive perfume and growing dread. This moment has been building for 6 months, ever since I first noticed strange coincidences in foundation paperwork. To protect donors who believe their money funds charitable programs instead of business development schemes. Truth shared quietly often cuts deeper than arguments shouted loudly. Margaret leans forward, sharp attention of someone who built her career recognizing financial irregularities. Emma, are you saying our donations have been screening processes for vendor selection? I'm saying every major foundation contract in 18 months went to families or businesses that donated substantial amounts within 60 days of contract announcements. The afternoon light has shifted, painting everything amber and ominous. Through tall windows, I can see normal country club activities continuing. Tennis matches, golf foursomes, families enjoying lunch without realizing someone's carefully constructed world is collapsing one table over. People often redirect anger toward messengers instead of messages when messages threaten their comfortable assumptions. This is absolutely ridiculous, Patricia snaps, composure cracking like old paint. You're weaving conspiracy theories from coincidences. Then let's test the theory. The foundation is currently soliciting bids for youth center construction. Let's see which companies make the largest donations over the next 30 days, then observe which firm gets the contract. Patricia's laugh holds no music anymore. Emma, you clearly don't understand legitimate business networking in philanthropic circles. You're right. That's why I consulted someone who does. Sometimes revealing you've been playing a different game entirely is more powerful than any single move. I reach into my purse and place a business card on the table where everyone can see. Marcus Webb, Senior Investigator, State Attorney General's Charitable Organizations Division. Complete silence. Even background music seems to pause. Emma, Margaret says very quietly, you've been working with state investigators? I've been trying to understand whether patterns I observed represent normal business relationships or something requiring regulatory oversight. Patricia's face has gone from white to gray. You reported us? I consulted regulatory experts about hypothetical patterns in charitable operations. Marcus was very interested in my documentation. When elegant crime meets patient investigation, results arrive faster than anyone expects. What documentation? Joyce asks, though her tone suggests she dreads the answer. Donation records cross-referenced with contract awards, email communications about vendor selection, board meeting minutes discussing donor relationship management, financial reports showing correlation between contributions and business opportunities. I pause, letting implications settle. Patricia, you kept excellent records, very thorough documentation of how donor relationships translated into business development. Marcus was particularly interested in your email describing the process as ensuring charitable partners understand the full range of opportunities available through foundation relationships. Criminal pride in systematic organization often provides the best evidence for prosecution. Patricia stands again, movements jerky like her nervous system has shifted into emergency mode. Those were private communications. You had no right. Those were Foundation business communications sent from Foundation accounts discussing Foundation operations, official organizational records. How did you access Foundation emails? Patricia's voice carries sharp panic of someone realizing the scope of their exposure. I didn't access anything. You copied me on dozens of emails over 6 months, remember? As volunteer coordinator, you wanted me to understand how sophisticated charitable operations function. The most dangerous oversight is training someone to be harmless when they're actually learning to be effective. Emma, Margaret says slowly, what happens now? I look around at 4 women who entered this luncheon as Patricia's allies and are processing their transformation into evidence of systematic exploitation. Now we determine whether this represents sophisticated business development or simple fraud. Marcus will make that determination based on his investigation. Professional investigators ask different questions than amateur victims and get different results. Patricia's hands are visibly trembling now. Emma, you have no idea what you've unleashed. The Foundation serves important community needs. These relationships benefit everyone involved. Do they? Margaret, were you aware your technology contract included pricing 38% above market rates? Margaret's silence is answer enough. Joyce, did you know your gallery's commission rates were significantly higher than standard corporate procurement? We submitted competitive bids. Based on information Patricia provided about appropriate pricing for sophisticated clients. When corruption is systemic, everyone becomes complicit without understanding their role. The afternoon feels heavy now, weighted with revelations that will reshape multiple families' understanding of their recent business success. So, what Patricia created, I continue, was a system where donors paid premium prices for business opportunities while believing they were receiving special recognition for charitable commitment. Everyone benefited, Patricia insists desperately. Everyone except the communities that should have received full value for donated dollars. So why does Patricia's complete panic feel less like victory and more like necessary surgery on an infected system? Emma, you have no clue what you've started, Patricia hisses, her voice dropping all pretense of public politeness. The other women at our table have gone silent, their faces cycling through shock, calculation, and what looks like genuine horror. Margaret appears to be mentally calculating her family's financial exposure. Joyce seems to be reviewing every business transaction her gallery made through foundation connections. Linda looks like someone wondering whether her recent success was earned or purchased. When masks come off in public, audiences often realize they've been wearing costumes too. Patricia, I say, keeping my voice gentle and steady, what I've started is protecting people from being exploited. Exploited? Her laugh sounds like something breaking. These are mutually beneficial business relationships between informed adults. Everyone understood the arrangement. Did they? I open my folder again and pull out another document. Margaret, were you aware your technology contract included pricing that was 38% above standard market rates? Margaret's face goes pale. No. We submitted what we thought were competitive proposals. And Joyce, did you know your gallery's exclusive arrangement included commission structures significantly higher than typical corporate art procurement? Joyce's silence speaks volumes. Truth reorganizes relationships faster than any amount of careful social planning. You see, I continue, my voice carrying the calm precision of someone explaining a magic trick after the show. The beauty of Patricia's system was how well it worked for everyone. Donors received business opportunities that more than compensated for their charitable contributions. The foundation received funding, and Patricia received. I let the question hang there, watching Patricia's composure disintegrate in real time. I received the satisfaction of creating community partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Along with management fees, consulting payments, and administrative bonuses that somehow never appeared in published financial reports. Sometimes the most damaging evidence is simply what's missing from official documentation. The country club dining room feels charged now, like air before a thunderstorm. Conversations at nearby tables continue normally, but our corner has become its own universe of revelation and consequence. Emma, Margaret says slowly, are you telling us Patricia has been receiving personal compensation for facilitating business relationships through charitable donations? I'm telling you that Patricia's income doesn't match her salary and that state investigators have identified interesting discrepancies in foundation accounting. Patricia's hands are trembling visibly now, months of social training failing to control the physical symptoms of panic. This is character assassination. You're destroying reputations based on speculation. Actually, I'm sharing verifiable information with people who have the right to know how their money was managed. When elaborate systems of exploitation meet simple demands for transparency, the systems usually collapse quickly. What I want to understand, Joyce says, her voice sharp with the clarity of someone who's just realized they've been manipulated, is how long this has been operating. I check my notes. Based on documentation I've compiled, approximately 4 years, since Patricia took over foundation leadership. 4 years, Margaret repeats. 4 years of charitable donations becoming business development opportunities. 4 years of systematic exploitation disguised as sophisticated networking, I add. Though I should clarify, not everyone participated knowingly. Patricia's laugh holds no humor whatsoever. How generous of you to assume some donors were naive, rather than complicit. Some were naive, but you weren't, and neither was David. Sometimes the most devastating revelations are the ones that change everything you thought you knew about people you love. The silence that follows is profound, the kind of quiet that happens when someone learns something that fundamentally alters their understanding of their life. David? Patricia's voice carries genuine fear for the first time. What does David have to do with this? David handles legal paperwork for all foundation contracts, every vendor agreement, every consulting arrangement, every partnership structure. His firm has been foundation legal counsel for 3 years. I remove another document from my folder, this one bearing David's signature on every page. David designed the legal frameworks that created this system. He structured contracts to maximize benefits for donor families while maintaining technical legal compliance for foundation operations. When someone you love turns out to be someone you never really understood, grief feels indistinguishable from betrayal. Patricia sits down hard, her face processing this information like someone receiving a terminal diagnosis. Emma, you can't understand the complexity of what you're alleging. You're right. I couldn't understand it alone. That's why I worked with experts. What experts? Financial fraud investigators, nonprofit attorneys, forensic accountants, and patient state officials who've been waiting for someone to document exactly this kind of systematic exploitation. Professional investigation moves differently than amateur suspicion. It builds cases instead of nursing grievances. The afternoon light has that golden quality that makes everything look temporary, like scenes painted in watercolors that might wash away with the next rain. At our table, 4 women are realizing their charitable giving funded personal enrichment rather than community development. Emma, Margaret asks quietly, what happens to money we've already donated? That depends on the investigation's findings, but going forward, foundation operations will have substantially different oversight structures. And Patricia? Joyce adds. I look across the table at my mother-in-law, this woman who spent 5 years convincing me I lacked the sophistication to understand how successful people conducted business. Patricia will have opportunities to demonstrate her sophistication to state investigators and possibly federal prosecutors. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the whisper carries further than any shout. The conversation continues for another 20 minutes, but the important information has been exchanged. Patricia sits quietly now, no longer defending or explaining, just processing the reality that her carefully constructed system has been documented by someone she dismissed as harmlessly naive. As we prepare to leave, Margaret approaches me privately. Emma, I want you to know, what you did took courage and skill. We all underestimated you. Patricia made it easy. She kept perfect records of illegal activity and shared them with someone she assumed was too unsophisticated to understand their significance. So why does watching her finally understand she misjudged me feel less like victory and more like the saddest kind of necessary medicine? Driving home feels like traveling through a world that's been fundamentally altered. Everything looks the same. Same roads, same houses, same trees. But underneath, the foundation of my life has shifted in ways I'm still processing. I pull into our driveway at 4:30, parking my Honda between David's BMW and Patricia's Mercedes. The contrast feels symbolic somehow, like a visual representation of the class differences that have defined our family dynamics for years. Truth spoken in private spaces takes root differently than truth revealed in public. It grows in relationships rather than reputations. David waits on the front porch, still in his court clothes, but carrying tension in his shoulders that speaks of someone who's received very bad news from multiple sources. His face shows the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that don't fit. Emma, he says as I approach the flagstone path we installed for our 2nd anniversary. We need to talk. I settle onto our porch swing, the same spot where we've shared countless conversations about everything and nothing. I imagine we do. Mother called me 3 times from the club. She says you've been working with the Attorney General to investigate the foundation. Sometimes the most shocking discoveries are about things that were always there, waiting for us to be brave enough to see them. That's not exactly accurate. I've been documenting patterns in foundation operations and sharing concerns with regulatory experts. David sits beside me, the swing's familiar creak providing soundtrack for a conversation that will reshape everything we thought we knew about our marriage. Emma, do you understand what you've done? Mother's life work, the foundation's reputation, my firm's largest client relationship? David, do you understand what you've done? The question settles between us like morning mist. David's face cycles through confusion, calculation, something that might be fear. What I've done? I've provided legal counsel for legitimate charitable operations. When love meets calculated deception, the result is often a choice between comfort and truth. I reach into my purse and pull out a different folder from the one I used at the club, this one containing documents far more personal, far more damaging to the man I promised to love, for better or worse. David, I've spent 6 months reviewing every contract your firm drafted for the foundation, every vendor agreement, every consulting arrangement, every partnership structure. That's confidential attorney-client information. You had no right. I had every right. I'm your wife, and I'm also a foundation board member. Those documents were part of my fiduciary responsibility to review. David goes pale. Emma, you don't understand the complexity of nonprofit legal structures. Then explain the complexity of structuring vendor contracts to maximize benefits for donor families while minimizing tax obligations for the foundation. The most sophisticated criminals often reveal themselves by assuming everyone else is too naive to understand sophisticated crime. I open the folder and remove a contract bearing David's signature, his firm's letterhead, and language clearly designed by someone who understood exactly how to exploit charitable tax law. Explain why every major contract includes clauses providing donor families with additional business opportunities beyond primary agreements. David studies the document with careful attention of someone seeing their own work from a perspective they'd never considered. Emma, these are standard business relationship agreements, networking opportunities that benefit everyone involved. Including us? What do you mean? I pull out another document showing payments from the foundation to David's firm, amounts significantly higher than typical legal fees for nonprofit work. I mean the consulting fees your firm has been receiving, the management bonuses, the percentage of vendor contracts that somehow always include additional legal services provisions. When someone you love turns out to be someone you never really knew, grief becomes indistinguishable from betrayal. David's silence stretches taut with implications neither of us is ready to acknowledge. The porch swing continues its gentle motion, carrying us back and forth over a conversation that will change our lives permanently. Emma, you're my wife. Why didn't you come to me with questions before involving state investigators? Because you're not just my husband, David. You're also the architect of this entire system. I remove one final document, an email chain between David and Patricia dating back 3 years, discussing strategies for optimizing donor relationships and creating sustainable revenue streams through charitable partnerships. You designed this, David. Not just contracts, the entire system. How donations trigger business opportunities, how foundation resources get diverted to vendor families, how legal fees get structured to avoid regulatory oversight. The deepest betrayals often feel both shocking and inevitable when finally revealed. David reads through the emails slowly, his face like someone watching their life being rewritten in real time. When he finishes, he sets the papers down carefully and looks at me with eyes I don't recognize. How long have you known? 6 months of documenting, 2 years of suspecting, 5 years of feeling like there was something about this family I was too unsophisticated to understand. The late afternoon breeze carries jasmine scent through air that feels thick with endings and beginnings. Somewhere in the distance, church bells mark the hour with songs that sound like funeral music. Emma, I never meant for you to get hurt by this. You meant for me to stay ignorant of this. There's a difference. Healing begins when we stop protecting people from consequences they've created through their own, mistaken choices. What happens now? David asks. And for the first time since I've known him, he sounds genuinely uncertain about his ability to control a situation's outcome. Now you call your criminal attorney and prepare for the Attorney General's investigation. You explain to your law partners why your largest client is about to become a federal case study in charitable fraud, and you figure out whether our marriage was built on love or simply on your assumption that I'd never be smart enough to understand what you were really doing. David stands slowly, movements carrying careful control of someone whose world has shifted off its axis. Emma, everything I did was to build a good life for us. Everything you did was to build a life that required me to stay naive in order to stay comfortable. The sun sets behind Connecticut hills, painting everything gold and ending. At some point during our conversation, I realize I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt. I'm simply awake in a way I haven't been for 5 years. So why does David's complete bewilderment feel less like victory and more like the moment I finally understood what sophisticated really means? The house feels different after David leaves to meet his attorney. Not empty. I've been alone here many times during our marriage. Different in the way spaces change when you finally understand their true purpose. When pretenses disappear, what remains is either nothing or everything, and we get to choose which. I walk through rooms that intimidated me for 5 years, past furniture that costs more than most families' annual salaries, around artwork Patricia selected to demonstrate sophisticated taste, rather than genuine appreciation for beauty. Every elegant detail now feels like evidence of a performance I was cast in without understanding my role. The investigation will unfold over months. Federal cases move with glacial precision, slowly but with devastating thoroughness. David's law firm will probably survive, though their reputation needs careful rebuilding. Patricia will face charges that could reshape her remaining years. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing authenticity when comfortable lies feel safer. My phone buzzes constantly with calls from family members, foundation board members, reporters who've somehow caught wind of the story. I turn it off, needing silence to process what I've accomplished and what it means for everything that comes next. The strangest part is how calm I feel. For 5 years, I carried constant anxiety of someone trying very hard to become worthy of acceptance. Tonight, I feel the particular peace that comes from understanding that the approval I'd been seeking was never actually available, because it was never about my worthiness. Sometimes the most sophisticated act is admitting we've been performing sophistication. I find myself in David's study, surrounded by law books and diplomas that now look like props in a performance about legitimacy. His desk holds contracts he was reviewing when I called to say I was coming home early from the charity luncheon. Among them, I discover something that makes my heart ache unexpectedly: a folder labeled Emma Anniversary Gift Planning. Inside, detailed research about a nonprofit that helps women start small businesses in developing countries. David had apparently been planning a significant donation in my name, funding microloans for women entrepreneurs in Guatemala. Love and manipulation can coexist in the same heart, which makes forgiveness both necessary and complicated. The gift would have been perfect, meaningful, aligned with my values, generous in ways that honored who I actually am rather than who Patricia thought I should become. It was also probably funded with money systematically stolen from charitable donors over 4 years. I sit in David's leather chair and try to reconcile the man who spent weeks researching organizations that would make me happy with the man who spent years designing systems to exploit charitable trust for personal gain. When people we love disappoint us, we often discover they're more complex than our disappointment allows. Evening brings visitors. Margaret arrives at 7:30, carrying wine and the expression of someone who spent the afternoon recalculating her family's financial relationships. Joyce follows 20 minutes later with homemade soup and questions about legal representation. Linda comes last, bringing flowers and the particular energy of someone who discovered most of her recent business success had been purchased rather than earned. We sit in the estate's formal living room, a space that always felt like a museum to me, and have the most honest conversation I've experienced in this house since moving in 5 years ago. Emma, Margaret says, setting down her wine glass with careful precision, we need to understand our legal exposure. And our moral exposure, Joyce adds quietly. I keep thinking about all the legitimate charities that didn't receive funding because we were unknowingly participating in this arrangement. Real wealth isn't about possessing beautiful things. It's about creating spaces where truth can exist without permission. What I keep thinking about, Linda says, is how clever it was. Every family felt like we were receiving special recognition for our charitable commitment. We all believed we'd earned these business opportunities through our community involvement. That's what made it so effective. Patricia created a system where everyone felt valued and successful, even while being systematically exploited. Margaret leans forward. Emma, when did you realize what was happening? I think about the question, tracing the path from first uncomfortable feelings about foundation operations to the moment I decided to document my concerns. Honestly, I think I started suspecting during our second Christmas dinner here. Patricia made some comment about charitable giving being really about relationship building, and David immediately started explaining the strategic aspects of our foundation contributions. Children don't naturally think strategically about generosity. They're taught to calculate returns on compassion. But what made you decide to investigate rather than just accept how things worked? The question touches something deep and raw, a place where confusion had been slowly transformed into clarity over months of careful observation and documentation. Because I realized that if I was wrong about my suspicions, documenting them wouldn't harm anyone. But if I was right and I didn't document them, the harm would continue indefinitely. The most elegant solution to feeling powerless is usually just paying closer attention to where power actually lies. Joyce nods slowly. So, you chose to be uncomfortable in the short term to prevent ongoing harm in the long term. I chose to trust what I was seeing rather than accepting explanations that felt designed to make me stop looking. The evening light fades to deep blue that comes just before full darkness, and the formal living room feels less like a museum and more like a space where important conversations can happen. For the first time since moving into this house, I feel like I belong here. Not because I've earned acceptance, but because I've finally stopped needing it. Love multiplies when shared, like light from a candle that can ignite 1,000 others without diminishing itself. What happens now? Linda asks. To all of us, I mean. Now we figure out how to use our resources to actually serve the communities we thought we were helping all along. We learn from being manipulated and we make sure it doesn't happen to other families. And David? Margaret asks gently. I look around the elegant room that intimidated me for so long, thinking about the man who brought me here with promises of love and partnership, who then spent years protecting me from information he thought would be too complicated for me to understand. David will have to figure out whether he can love someone who refused to stay naive for his convenience. So why does finally feeling at home in this house feel less like victory and more like the moment I realized I'd outgrown needing to live here? The months that followed brought a different kind of routine to the Whitmore estate. Slower, more intentional, punctuated by legal meetings rather than charity luncheons. David moved into the guest house while his attorney prepared his defense strategy, maintaining physical distance that somehow made emotional honesty possible for the first time in our marriage. Justice isn't always about who wins. Sometimes it's about everyone learning to play a completely different game. The Attorney General's investigation proceeded with the methodical thoroughness I'd expected. Marcus Webb turned out to be exactly the kind of investigator I'd hoped for. Patient, detail-oriented, more interested in understanding systematic problems than punishing individual people. His team spent weeks reviewing the documentation I'd provided, interviewing foundation board members, and tracing financial relationships that had been carefully concealed for years. Mrs. Whitmore, he'd told me during one of our meetings, This case represents one of the most sophisticated charitable fraud schemes we've encountered. The legal structures your husband created were remarkably effective at disguising financial exploitation as legitimate networking. Real sophistication doesn't eliminate other forms of justice. It creates space for accountability to exist in all its complex forms. Patricia's response to the investigation surprised everyone, including her own attorney. Rather than fighting the charges or attempting to minimize her role, she pled guilty to all counts and requested an opportunity to address the families who'd been affected by her actions. The meeting took place at the Foundation's headquarters on a Tuesday morning in February, 6 months after the charity luncheon that had started everything. Patricia sat at the conference table where she'd orchestrated so many business arrangements disguised as charitable planning, facing the families whose trust she'd systematically exploited. "I want to begin," Patricia said, her voice carrying none of its former musical confidence, "by acknowledging that what I did was wrong, not misunderstood, not overly complex, not taken out of context, simply wrong." When people feel safe to be authentic, they reveal capabilities that performance always obscures. She looked older than her 68 years, worn down by months of legal proceedings and the particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining lies for so long that you forget what truth feels like. But there was something in her posture that suggested relief rather than defeat. The appearance of someone finally able to stop performing. "I convinced myself that everyone was benefiting from the arrangements I'd created. Donors received business opportunities. The foundation received funding. Community projects were completed. It seemed like a sophisticated solution to the challenge of sustainable fundraising." Mrs. Henderson, who'd become something of a spokesperson for the affected families, leaned forward with the expression of someone seeking understanding rather than revenge. "Patricia, what I want to understand is how you justified taking personal compensation from a system that was supposed to serve charitable purposes. True elegance isn't about impressing people, it's about including them in something meaningful." Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she consulted notes she'd prepared for this conversation. "I justified it by convincing myself that my management of these relationships was a professional service worth professional compensation. I told myself that my ability to create mutually beneficial partnerships was a skill that deserved recognition. But you never disclosed that compensation to the families whose donations were funding it," Mrs. Chen pointed out, her tone curious rather than accusatory. "No, I didn't. Because I knew that if people understood how the system actually worked, they wouldn't participate. And I needed them to participate because—" Patricia paused, her composure cracking like ice under spring sunshine. "Because I'd gotten addicted to feeling important, to being the person who could solve problems and create opportunities, to being sophisticated. When elegant corruption meets patient accountability, the outcome is often surprisingly healing." The silence that followed was profound but not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that creates space for truth to settle into understanding rather than judgment. "Patricia," I said gently, "what would you want people to learn from what happened here?" She looked at me with eyes that held gratitude rather than resentment, despite everything that had transpired between us. "I'd want people to learn that sophistication without integrity is just elaborate selfishness. That charity means putting other people's needs ahead of your own comfort, not finding clever ways to serve yourself while appearing to serve others. The most powerful revolution is often the quiet one, when people choose understanding over punishment, growth over revenge." David's case was more complex, involving both his professional conduct as an attorney and his personal participation in the foundation's operations. His law firm ultimately received a substantial fine and agreed to implement new oversight procedures for charitable client relationships. David himself faced professional sanctions that would reshape his legal career. "Emma," he'd told me during one of our careful conversations in the weeks following Patricia's plea agreement, I need you to understand that I never intended to deceive you. I know, I'd replied, sitting across from him in the guest house that had become his temporary residence. You intended to protect me from information you thought would complicate my ability to be happy in this family. Isn't that what love is supposed to do? Protect the people we care about? The question had haunted me for weeks afterward, because the answer was both yes and no, in ways that defied simple resolution. Love that requires someone to remain ignorant isn't protection, it's imprisonment disguised as care. The foundation itself underwent complete restructuring, with new management, transparent accounting procedures, and oversight by an independent board of directors that included several of the families who'd been affected by Patricia's system. Margaret agreed to serve as interim director, bringing her business experience and hard-won understanding of how charitable operations could be corrupted. Emma, she'd asked me during one of our planning meetings, would you consider joining the board? Your experience with identifying financial irregularities could help us prevent this from happening again. The invitation felt like recognition in ways that Patricia's attempts at inclusion never had, acknowledgement of actual skills rather than requests to perform sophistication. True sophistication creates systems that serve integrity rather than requiring integrity to serve systems. My marriage to David remained in careful reconstruction, both of us learning to love each other as the people we actually were rather than the people we'd assumed each other to be. We attended counseling together, exploring the difference between protection and deception, between loyalty and enabling, between sophisticated solutions and simply honest ones. Emma, David had said during one particularly difficult session, can you forgive someone who genuinely believed they were protecting you by keeping you ignorant? I can forgive you, I'd replied carefully, but I can't go back to being someone who needs that kind of protection. So why did learning to love each other honestly feel less like victory and more like the most sophisticated challenge we'd ever undertaken? Uring, with new management, transparent accounting procedures, and oversight by an independent board of directors that included several of the families who'd been affected by Patricia's system. Mrs. Henderson agreed to serve as interim director, bringing her business experience and hard-won understanding of how charitable operations could be corrupted. Emma, she'd asked me during one of our planning meetings, would you consider joining the board? Your experience with identifying financial irregularities could help us prevent this from happening again. The invitation felt like recognition in ways that Patricia's attempts at inclusion never had, acknowledgement of actual skills rather than requests to perform sophistication. True sophistication creates systems that serve integrity rather than requiring integrity to serve systems. My marriage to David remained in careful reconstruction, both of us learning to love each other as the people we actually were rather than the people we'd assumed each other to be. We attended counseling together, exploring the difference between protection and deception, between loyalty and enabling, between sophisticated solutions and simply honest ones. Emma, David had said during one particularly difficult session, can you forgive someone who genuinely believed they were protecting you by keeping you ignorant? I can forgive you, I'd replied carefully, but I can't go back to being someone who needs that kind of protection. So why did learning to love each other honestly feel less like victory and more like the most sophisticated challenge we'd ever undertaken? The morning of Patricia's sentencing dawned clear and cold, one of those February days when winter shows its most beautiful face before retreating into memory. I sat in the federal courthouse in Hartford beside David, both of us present to witness the conclusion of a story that had reshaped our understanding of family, justice, and the complex relationship between love and accountability. Some mornings arrive carrying gifts we didn't know we were hoping for. Patricia walked into the courtroom with the dignity of someone who'd finally learned the difference between sophisticated appearance and authentic grace. She'd spent the past months not just preparing for sentencing, but actively working to repair the damage she'd caused, liquidating personal assets to fund restitution payments, providing detailed cooperation with ongoing investigations, and volunteering with organizations that served the communities her foundation had claimed to support. Your Honor, Patricia's attorney began, Mrs. Whitmore has demonstrated genuine remorse for her actions and has taken extraordinary steps to make amends for the harm she caused. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen every variation of human mistake and redemption, reviewed the case materials with careful attention before addressing Patricia directly. Mrs. Whitmore, you've pled guilty to multiple counts of charitable fraud, tax evasion, and financial exploitation. These are serious crimes that violated the trust of donors who believed their contributions were serving charitable purposes. When people learn to see justice as healing rather than punishment, the results often exceed what anyone involved imagined was possible. Yes, Your Honor, Patricia replied, her voice steady but carrying none of the musical performance that had characterized her public speaking for years. I understand the severity of my actions and the harm I caused to families who trusted me with their charitable intentions. What I find most significant about your case, Judge Morrison continued, is not just the sophistication of the fraud you orchestrated, but the thoroughness of your efforts to repair the damage once it was exposed. Tell me about your restitution efforts. Patricia had liquidated her art collection, sold her vacation properties, and restructured her financial holdings to provide full restitution to affected families, plus additional funding for legitimate charitable programs. The total exceeded $2.3 million, significantly more than the amount she'd personally gained from the foundation's operations. I realized, Patricia said, that the only way to demonstrate genuine remorse was to ensure that every family affected by my actions was financially whole, and that communities were better served than they would have been if I'd never interfered with charitable processes. Real luxury isn't about possessing beautiful things. It's about creating beauty that outlasts the creator. The families Patricia had manipulated were present in the courtroom, but not as traditional victims seeking maximum punishment. Mrs. Henderson had submitted a letter on Patricia's behalf, acknowledging both the harm she'd caused and the meaningful steps she'd taken toward repair. Mrs. Chen had written about Patricia's assistance in establishing new oversight procedures for charitable organizations. Mrs. Parker had documented Patricia's volunteer work with arts programs in underserved communities. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Morrison said, the typical sentence for crimes of this nature and scope would be significant federal prison time. However, your case presents unusual circumstances. She reviewed Patricia's cooperation with investigators, her complete financial restitution, her ongoing volunteer commitments, and the letters from families requesting consideration of alternative sentencing. I'm sentencing you to 2 years of supervised probation, including 2,000 hours of community service, specifically with organizations that provide oversight and education for charitable operations. You'll also be permanently banned from serving in any fiduciary capacity for charitable organizations. When elegant systems of accountability meet genuine efforts at repair, they often create more healing than traditional punishment. Patricia accepted the sentence with grace that felt authentic rather than performed, thanking the judge and the families who'd chosen understanding over vengeance. As we left the courthouse, I realized that the sophisticated woman I'd been intimidated by for 5 years had finally become someone I could actually respect. David's professional sanctions were announced the following week: suspension from practicing law for 18 months, required completion of ethics training, and supervised practice for 3 years following reinstatement. His law firm survived, but with substantially changed procedures for client oversight and charitable organization representation. Emma, he told me that evening as we sat on the porch swing where so many important conversations had unfolded, I know I can't undo the deception, but I want to understand how to rebuild trust between us. The question had been implicit in our relationship for months, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like permission to explore possibilities I'd been afraid to name. Love multiplied is love multiplied. Hearts expand to hold whatever honesty they're offered, rather than operating from protection, requiring strategic withholding. I think, I said carefully, that trust gets rebuilt through choosing transparency even when it's uncomfortable, and through proving that you can love someone who refuses to stay naive for your convenience. Can you teach me how to do that? His question carried genuine humility that I'd never heard from him before, the sound of someone finally understanding that love isn't about managing other people's perceptions, but about creating space for authentic relationship. We can learn together, both of us. Healing begins when we stop protecting people from consequences they've earned and start supporting them through the growth those consequences make possible. The Foundation's rebuilding efforts continued through spring and summer, with new leadership creating transparent processes for both fundraising and vendor selection. The organization that emerged bore little resemblance to Patricia's elegant system of mutual exploitation. It was smaller, more focused, dramatically more accountable to both donors and recipients. Mrs. Henderson proved to be exactly the kind of leader the Foundation needed: experienced in business, skeptical of elaborate explanations, committed to ensuring that every donated dollar served its intended purpose. Under her guidance, the organization developed oversight procedures that other charitable groups began adopting as best practices. Emma, she told me during one of our quarterly board meetings, what you did? Documenting problems and insisting on accountability. It's created ripple effects far beyond our foundation. Other organizations are reviewing their own practices, implementing better oversight, being more transparent with donors. Justice served with patience creates abundance rather than scarcity, healing rather than punishment. As autumn arrived, I realized that the Whitmore estate felt like home in ways it never had during the years when I'd been trying to earn belonging through performance. David and I had learned to love each other as the people we actually were, rather than the people we'd assumed each other wanted us to become. Patricia visited occasionally, usually to update us on her community service work or to share insights she'd gained from her mandated counseling sessions. These conversations carried none of the tension that had characterized our family interactions for years. They were simply honest exchanges between people who'd all learned difficult lessons about the difference between sophisticated appearance and authentic substance. So why did watching our family learn to tell each other the truth feel like the most sophisticated achievement of all? The kind that whispers rather than announces, the kind that heals rather than impresses. 1 year later, the afternoon light slants through my home office windows differently now, warmer somehow, as if honesty has changed the molecular structure of illumination itself. I'm no longer living at the Whitmore estate. David and I purchased a smaller house in West Hartford, close enough to his law practice but far enough from family legacy that we could build something entirely our own. Real transformation doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It reveals itself through changed patterns of daily living. My work has evolved as well. The documentation skills I'd developed while investigating the Foundation's operations proved valuable to other organizations seeking to improve their accountability practices. I now consult with charitable groups, helping them develop oversight procedures and donor transparency systems that prevent the kind of exploitation Patricia had perfected. Emma, my client from this morning, had said, reviewing the audit procedures I'd designed for her youth development organization. These systems are incredibly thorough. You've thought of vulnerabilities I never would have imagined. When you've seen how sophisticated people can exploit trust, I'd replied, you learn to design protections that are equally sophisticated. When we stop performing worthiness, we discover we were worthy all along. Patricia calls occasionally, usually to share updates about her community service work or to ask advice about oversight procedures for the organizations where she volunteers. Her voice carries a quality I'd never heard during the years when she was managing the foundation: genuine humility mixed with authentic expertise, rather than performed authority. "Emma, I've been thinking about something you said during my sentencing preparation," she told me last week. "About sophistication without integrity being elaborate selfishness. I keep learning new applications for that principle." Her transformation has been the most surprising aspect of this entire journey. The woman who'd spent years manipulating charitable systems for personal gain has become one of the most effective advocates for transparent nonprofit management in Connecticut. The most unexpected gifts often come disguised as problems requiring creative solutions. David returns home each evening carrying case files rather than foundation contracts, his legal practice now focused on small business development and family law rather than the complex financial structures he'd once specialized in creating. The work pays less but requires none of the ethical compromises that had slowly eroded his integrity over years of designing systems to exploit charitable trust. "I never realized," he told me recently, "how exhausting it was to constantly manage information to protect you from understanding what I was really doing for work. I never realized how lonely it was to be protected from understanding the person I was married to," I'd replied. True sophistication doesn't eliminate difficulty. It creates honest spaces where difficulties can be addressed directly. Our marriage has been rebuilt on foundations so different from the original that sometimes it feels like we're different people who happen to share a history. We attend counseling together monthly, not because our relationship is troubled, but because we've learned that professional guidance helps us navigate honesty in ways we'd never been taught. The other foundation families have also found their own paths forward. Mrs. Henderson continues leading the reorganized foundation with the systematic thoroughness that has made it a model for other charitable organizations. Mrs. Chen has become an advocate for increased oversight of nonprofit business relationships. Mrs. Parker has redirected her art gallery's community involvement toward direct support of local artists rather than corporate partnerships. Revolutionary ideas often sound remarkably like ancient wisdom: tell the truth, treat people fairly, use resources to serve others. What's interesting to me, Mrs. Henderson mentioned during our most recent board meeting, is how much more effective our charitable work has become now that we're focused on actual community needs rather than managing relationships between donors and business partners. The numbers support her observation. The restructured foundation has distributed more money to community programs in its first year under new management than it had in the previous 3 years combined under Patricia's leadership. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about ensuring resources flow toward their intended purposes. As evening becomes darkness, I find myself reflecting on the journey from that charity luncheon 15 months ago to the quiet satisfaction of work that serves integrity rather than requiring integrity to serve elaborate deceptions. The most profound change has been learning to trust my own perceptions rather than accepting explanations designed to make me stop asking questions. For years, I'd assumed that my discomfort with family dynamics was evidence of my own social inadequacy. Now I understand it was actually evidence of ethical clarity trying to surface through layers of sophisticated rationalization. The strongest foundations aren't built to impress, they're built to support authentic living. 5 lessons have emerged from this experience that now guide everything I do, personally and professionally. First, when someone consistently makes you feel unsophisticated for asking simple questions, the problem usually isn't your questions, it's their answers. Second, real sophistication creates transparency and accountability rather than requiring elaborate explanations for why transparency isn't possible. Third, love that demands ignorance isn't protection, it's control disguised as care, and it ultimately serves the controller rather than the protected. Fourth, justice doesn't always require punishment. Sometimes it simply requires ensuring that systems serve their stated purposes rather than hidden agendas. Fifth, The most elegant response to being underestimated is not to prove your sophistication through performance, but to demonstrate it through effectiveness that speaks for itself. So, why does watching David carry home honest work, Patricia serve communities she once exploited, and our family learn to love each other truthfully, feel like the most sophisticated victory of all? The kind that heals rather than hurts, the kind that creates abundance rather than scarcity, the kind that whispers rather than shouts.